Good afternoon, DC. It's so great to be back here with all of you in one of my favorite cities. And I'm thrilled to be here with David of the DC Public Library. Public libraries have been so important in my life. We might get into that with Christine and Loyalty Bookstore. Bookstores have also been incredibly important to me. And if I'd grown up in San Jose with a Black, Asian, queer-owned bookstore, my life would have taken a completely different direction. Grateful to Eric and Peter Steinhauer of Vietnam Society for helping to sponsor this event. And I'm just really thrilled to be here with Leslie Tenorio because we were classmates at UC Berkeley together. Woo! Yes. Too bad there's no Stanford people here because we could say some Stanford. But sometimes I start off with comments and everything, but because we've known each other for so long, I thought we would just chat for like 30 or 40 minutes or something like that. And
works for me.
Yeah, cool. But thank you so much for being here. I mean, so we were classmates together, and I remember reading your short stories when we were students, and I was like, God, this guy's so talented. I suck. And
that's what I thought too.
So anyway, it's just a delight to be here with you.
No, it's great to be here, and congratulations on this book. It's incredible. Some parts made me, in a good way, uncomfortable. Some parts kind of made me weep. Other parts made me laugh. And you definitely need to get this book after and get it signed because it's such a it's a profound and powerful book, and it's not what one normally expects when you say the word memoir. And as the cover says, it's a memoir, a history, and a memorial, and I think it is very much those things. So for those of you who like reading memoir, it delivers the promise of a memoir, but it delivers way more than that too. So it's a vital and utterly singular book. And can I ask a question? So why? I guess why now? Why I know you've written nonfiction before, but after 2 novels, a collection of stories, what made you decide to venture into memoir/history/memorial?
Yeah, I resisted writing a memoir for a very long time in my life because I thought my life was very boring. And the people whose lives were really interesting that were close to me were my parents. And so when it finally came time when I started to delve more into nonfiction writing and dealing more with the history of the Vietnam War and its impact on my family, the more my writing started to get autobiographical because I realized I just couldn't approach this history from the perspective of fiction or scholarship, but I had to bring more and more of myself into it. And when the pandemic happened, I had to do something, so I wrote this book. And so in one sense, it took me 2 years to write this book. But in another sense, it took me 32 years to write this book because the origins of it lay in an essay that I wrote at UC Berkeley when I was 19 and an undergraduate there. And I took a nonfiction writing seminar with the writer Maxine Hong Kingston, whom I hope many of you know, but yeah, all right. 1%, awesome. But she's the author of many books, but at the time, most notably, The Woman Warrior, which I'll reference throughout the course of this afternoon, the most widely taught book on college campuses at the time, or so it was said. I was 19 years old, so what did I care? I got into this 14-person writing seminar. I sat this far away from Maxine nearly every single day, and every single day, I would fall asleep. And Maxine has told me to my face that I was the worst student in her class. Everyone else got an A, and I got a B+, otherwise known as an Asian F. Okay. And at the end of the semester, Maxine writes everybody a note, and in my note, she says, "You should go seek counseling." And of course I didn't. I became a writer instead. But I thought that I was normal, and Maxine thought I was disturbed in some way. And I think we were both right, because by the time I was 19 or 20, I obviously could function very well. I went to school at Berkeley, and I got good grades outside of her class. But what she read in that essay, she found disturbing. And what I'd written about in that essay was how my mother had gone to or been committed to a psychiatric facility. And obviously, that was a very disturbing experience for her, but also for our entire family and for me. So I wrote that essay, and then I put it into a milk crate, and I put the milk crate into my closet, and I didn't look at it for 30 years. And then during the pandemic, I looked at it. And through the past 30 years, I've been telling myself that my mother had gone to this psychiatric facility when I was a little boy, because that's how I felt, terrified and childlike. And then I read the essay, and I realized she had gone to that psychiatric facility when I was 18, and I'd written about it a year later. So even though I was a young adult, even though I'd written this essay, my mind, my memory had completely changed the details, the facts, some very key facts, to deceive me or to protect me. And that was my first clue in rereading that essay, that in fact there was something I needed to do here. There was something I needed to investigate. And our shared writing teacher, Bharati Mukherjee, who also gave me a B+, when she read my short stories back then, said, you need to cut to the bone. And then when I was 19 or 20, I had no idea how to do that. And so it would take me 30 years to try to figure that out, to get the artistic ability, to get the wisdom, but also to get the courage, I think, to confront myself and my emotional vulnerability, which I never wanted to admit. And I think that's what it takes to write a memoir, because I hope none of you need to write a memoir. Because if you need to write a memoir, something terrible has probably happened in your life, okay? Unless you're just a narcissistic influencer. But in order to write a memoir, you do have to cut to the bone, and that's going to hurt.
So speaking of cutting to the bone, there's this moment in the book where you talk about there's a home invasion when you're, I think you're teens, I believe, and your mother is able to get out of the house, and you see her fleeing down the street, and this memory really stays with you. And you talk about how this particular memory is something that you've had to care for a long time, and I was really struck by that. This idea that you have a memory with you that you hold on, and you kind of take care of it. Could you talk a little bit more about what you meant by taking care of the memory, and how this taking care of a memory impacted maybe the way you wrote this, or just the experience of writing it?
Well, I think when it comes to memory, there are two kinds of memories. One is the memory that we seek out. So we will actively try to recall something. And then there's the memory that will seek us out. We don't want to remember it, or we may not have any intention of remembering, but it's going to find us, okay? And this memory is both of those things, because memories, the memories that you tend to remember are also the memories that burn you. And when someone points a gun in your face in your house, that's going to burn. And so yes, that was what happened when I was about 16. My parents ran a grocery store, in this Vietnamese refugee community in the 1970s and 1980s, and my parents would always say, never open the door. Never open the door. Because we Vietnamese people had pioneered a whole new crime called the home invasion. And so never open the door to a Vietnamese person. And so one day, this guy knocks on our door, and he's not Vietnamese. He's a white guy. And my mom opens the door, and he has a gun. He's probably followed them home from the store. And he breaks in, and he says, get on the floor. And my father and I get on the floor. My mother just runs past him, screaming into the street. And he turns around, and he steps out, and then my father gets up and slams the door shut, locking him outside with my mother. And I see my mother running down the street. We live right next to the freeway entrance, and so the street in front of our house is always full of cars, and I see her through the living room window running down the street. I can't hear a thing, but she's, screaming. That saves our lives. How could she do that? Where did she find the ability to do that when my father and I did not? So I've never forgotten that, but I've cared for that memory in the sense that I've also tried to understand it. What does it mean? What does it say about me, my father, my mother? What does it say about this whole world of San Jose, of Vietnamese refugees? What does it say about violence? We had escaped from war and colonization, and here in San Jose, living in the American dream, it still found us. And it would take me, when I say I cared for that memory, I revisited it again and again. So the first time I ever dealt with it was in a short story called War Years, which is in the refugees. And that was the only autobiographical fiction I'd ever written. But it took me decades to be able to confront that through fiction. And then it would take me at least another 10 years before I could really grapple with it in nonfiction as well.
It's this idea of caring for memories. Obviously, you had to deal with a lot of memories in this book. This book is not only about dealing with memories, it's also very much dealing with issues that a lot of Asian Americans, Vietnamese Americans are grappling with now. Among those things, your family, politics, etc., you ultimately have to deal with yourself in this book. And you, as the writer, have a very interesting relationship to yourself as subject matter. At a certain point in the book, you say, I love this quote, you say, your habit is, you tend to be the reader, but never the text. But then you say, but what if you're both? Could you talk about dealing with yourself as a text as you wrote this book?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I thought I was normal as I was growing up was that I was not troubled by anything. I felt like I'm not mentally unstable like my mother seemed to be at some points. I'm not traumatized like so many other Vietnamese refugees are. But in reality, what I was I was numb. I was numb, and I go in the book. I go into these issues of abandonment. Like when we came to the United States in 1975, I was separated from my parents in order to leave the refugee camp. I was taken away and put into an American household while my parents went to another sponsor household. When you're 4 years old, you don't understand that this is supposedly being done for your own good. I just felt it as terror. And so my first memories are howling and screaming as I'm taken away from my parents. And I wouldn't come back for a few more months. My brother wouldn't come back for 2 years. And then we had left behind an adopted sister, my parents' adopted daughter. And of course, I knew I had one when I was 4, but again, I didn't remember that. So I grew up not knowing that I had an adopted sister until one day, when I was maybe 10 or 11, we get a letter in the mail from Vietnam, and there's a picture in there, black and white photograph of, by now, this young woman. And I was like, and I was told, this is your adopted sister. I was like, I have an adopted sister? Which means we left somebody behind. And I think for a lot of people who are refugees and immigrants, but also anybody who's been impacted by history, this question of what if is always there. Like, why me? Why did I survive? Why did I not get left behind? Why did history happen to me in a certain way, but to other people in a different way? And so we had left somebody behind. So abandonment, and my way of coping with it was to look forward and to prevent myself from feeling anything. And so, what was the question, by the way?
You as text.
Me as text. Therefore, how I protected myself was to be a very rational person, to feel like I could become an intellectual. I got a PhD in English, and to feel that I could master the text, I could master the world, I could master myself. And that meant not admitting any vulnerability, not admitting to any emotions, not admitting to any fear. And that was great for an academic. That's how I became successful as an academic. But in order to become a writer, I had to gradually confront the weakness, the vulnerability, the fear inside of me. I don't think you can become, and you can tell me, but a writer of poetry or of fiction or of memoir unless you're willing to confront the terror inside of yourself. And that's why a lot of people don't want to become writers, because for very good reason. If you don't want to spend your day every day looking into yourself, why should you? Because it's a terrifying space for a lot of people. And so for me to become a writer, I think I've become a better writer over the decades, as not only because I've learned the art better, but because I've been able to look inside myself and confront my own emotions as well, and to admit to vulnerability, and to admit that becoming a master is itself a form of self-deception, because no master is a master. All masters are undermined eventually by the things they can't admit to themselves. And I think as writers, at least for me, I had to acknowledge that mastery was an illusion, that my invulnerability was definitely a self-deception, and then I had to uncover where the fear and the terror was within inside of me.
So how does that work? Because you'd said that, like in your collection, for example, you have one story that's autobiographical. The rest of your fiction is fictional. It's not based on your factual life. How does confronting your vulnerability, your pain, your history factor into the process of creating something that is, on its surface, purely fictional?
Well, when I wrote The Sympathizer, for example, The Sympathizer is about a communist spy who is mixed race, an alcoholic, a womanizer, a liar, a traitor, ultimately a murderer. So completely autobiographical or not. You won't know for sure, but most people assume it's not autobiographical. But there is one element of autobiography in there for sure, which is he feels himself to be a man of two faces. He feels himself to be a person of duality. And when I was growing up, I felt like a spy because in my parents' very Vietnamese household, I felt like an American spying on them. And then when I stepped out into the rest of the American world, I felt like a Vietnamese spying on Americans. And I think that's actually very common, refugee, immigrant, person of color, so-called minority, or colonized experience, is that sense of duality, of being inside and outside all the time. And so I just took that feeling and I injected it into The Sympathizer. And what was the question again? So
The question was taking, really confronting yourself emotionally,
Yeah.
but writing things that are purely, on its surface, fictional.
yeah, so I mean, all the stuff that he goes through, I didn't go through in terms of spying and war and treachery and things like that. But as a writer, I have to imagine the plots and the themes and all that kind of stuff. But I'm never going to go out and murder someone. I don't, in order to have that experience. But I have to invest the character with emotions. If Chekhov, it was Chekhov who said, if there's tears in the writer, there will be tears in the reader. And I think that's true. So unless I can feel something and be willing to feel those emotions and put them into the characters, you're not going to feel anything. I mean, stories are more than just plots. Stories are also about those emotions as well and how we can elicit them from the reader. But before we can elicit them from the reader, we have to elicit them from ourselves as well. And so writing is, again, not just about the art. Writing is about the capacity to feel. It doesn't make you a better human being. There are a lot of writers who are total jerks, as far as I can tell. But in the spaces of their own imagination, their own rooms and so on, they have the capacity to feel very deeply. And I think that's just one of the great challenges that faces us writers.
You said growing up you felt like a spy. You had this duality. Do you still feel like a spy? Or are there dualities you feel now? Maybe there are different kinds of dualities?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think for most people, you don't want to feel duality because it's uncomfortable. Most people want to feel like they always fit in. And of course, I grew up wanting to fit in, but that's never been my fate. And so the duality is something that I've learned how to cultivate because I think duality is very good for a writer because duality, hopefully, if you embrace it, gives you an added capacity for compassion and empathy, both for yourself, but also for other people. And you really need that compassion and empathy to be a writer, but also to be a human being as well. That's why people who completely fit in are dangerous people, because they've never known what it's like to be an outsider. They've never known what it's like to be marginalized. They're not aware of their own capacity to damage and harm other people. Whereas if you have a sense of duality and you actually have been marginalized in some way, you know that that potential exists. Doesn't make you, again, doesn't necessarily make you a better human being because many people who've been subjected to a sense of duality want to forget that that exists and they just want to get inside and close the door behind them. That's why so many refugees and immigrants who have gone through so much to become a part of this country want to keep out refugees and immigrants. Right? It doesn't make them more compassionate to refugees and immigrants. In fact, there are Vietnamese Americans, and I quote one in this book. It's a real quote from a newspaper. Steve Tran of Orange County, 80 years old, during the Trump administration when the southern border the issues were happening and families were being broken up and children were being lost and people were being put into camps. He said, that's good. Trump is doing the right thing. Because we're the good refugees. Those are the bad refugees, the brown people, the Muslims, the non-white, and so on. So duality is not a condition of goodness or empathy or anything. It's a test. What are you going to do with your duality? Are you going to want to just, burrow further inside the power and assimilate? Or are you going to inhabit that duality and understand that our entire society is structured in that way, and try to open the door both to yourself but also for other people as well. And so that's one of the things that I talk a lot about in this book.
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement. This idea of duality as a test. I think as writers, I think we assume, oh, you're able to maintain this dual perspective, but you're totally right. It doesn't make you a better human being. And as you said, there are a lot of writers who are jerks. We both know this, so we won't name names. But yeah, that's
Two drinks later, and we might name names, but that's not going to happen right now.
Since you're talking about Steve Tran and his idea of the good refugee, a good part of this book really wants to make this distinction between refugee America and immigrant America. Could you talk about why that was an important aspect of this book for you?
Well, part of the mythology of the United States, and this book is very concerned with the mythology of the United States. America appears often in this book. And every time America appears in this book, the word is America capitalized TM, trademark. And I think the reason I did that is because America the word is so overwhelming for people of the United States of America. And the reason it's trademarked is because there are other Americans in the Americas who are not of the United States. And they will tell you, hey, we're Americans too. You don't own the word America, but in fact we do. That's why it's trademarked. So when we say the word America, people all over the world, most of them outside of the Americas, think of the United States. And America trademark, to me, is also a word that gestures at the fact that the fundamental aspect of this country is capitalism and colonization. And so the immigrant is a necessary part of this country. The immigrant is also an ambivalent part of this country. That's why we've lived through a very xenophobic time. We might still go back to that, in which many Americans want to keep immigrants out. But even so, the idea of the immigrant is core to the American mythology. We're the greatest country on earth. That's why immigrants want to come here. Refugees are different. Refugees are different because refugees are forced out. They don't necessarily want to come to this country. And refugees are produced, oftentimes by American policy. And there's a line in The Sympathizer where the narrator goes, he's a refugee now in the United States, he says, well, I'm grateful for American aid, but maybe I wouldn't need American aid if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place. Americans want to hear the first part, the refugee rescue narrative. They don't want to hear the second part, that we might have been responsible in some way for the production of these refugees, the various things that we've done as a country. And so for a lot of refugees who come to this country, they've internalized that. They understand that distinction. So most Vietnamese refugees I've met over my life do not call themselves refugees. They call themselves immigrants, even though they came here as refugees. And so I think it's so important to assert that those of us who have been refugees or are refugees, that we say that name, because then we acknowledge a very different political, material history, and that we force the country to confront that history. But we also force ourselves to confront that history. Because when you start calling yourself an immigrant, you have a very different mentality than if you say you're a refugee. Now, I'm no longer a refugee by fact or by law, but I've never forgotten being a refugee. And I've met, again, the flip side of those refugees who call themselves immigrants. I've met so many refugees also who are no longer refugees, but they still call themselves refugees because they've never ceased feeling emotionally like those displaced, dehumanized people. And we're living through a time period in which there are approximately, and my figures are already out of date, but at least 66 million displaced people in the world and 26 million or more refugees. And they are called a crisis, a refugee crisis. But they're not a crisis, they're people. The crisis is in us, in the nations that produce refugees. And so that's why I feel it's so important to inhabit that term and to claim that term and to deny that we should be treated as a crisis instead of the products of a crisis that's out of our control.
That's great. I have more questions, but I want to be mindful of the time. We still have time before. Okay, great. Speaking of crisis, you talk about the cliche of the identity crisis that is sometimes put upon, let's say, minority writers. In your book, there's a moment where you say you don't feel that you're suffering from an identity crisis, but from a political crisis. You might have touched upon this with your last answer, but will you talk a little bit more about that? Because I found that a really interesting point in the book.
Yeah, when I got to school at Berkeley, I felt like I had an identity crisis. Like, oh, you know, I'm Asian and I'm American, or I'm Vietnamese and I'm an American. And this is the late 80s, early 90s, and I was being taught by professors who had gone to Berkeley in the late 60s, and they had gone through an identity crisis. And now I go talk to a lot of college campuses, and the college students today tell me, we have an identity crisis. And I thought, I'm thinking, wait a minute, this current generation of teenagers and 20-somethings who happen to be of Asian descent, for example, you know, you guys have BTS. You have boba. You have fusion tacos. Why do you have an identity crisis? Because haven't we done everything that supposedly should resolve the identity crisis? Isn't that the idea? East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. But in fact, if the twain have met in the fusion taco, or if everybody loves BTS now, then everything should be cool, right? But no. I think the reason we see the repetition of the identity crisis is because it is a political crisis. East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet comes from Rudyard Kipling. But the poem's title is The White Man's Burden. He was writing that as a British poet and apologist for empire, encouraging the United States to colonize the Philippines and pick up the white man's burden. That's a political crisis. The reason why we have immigrants and refugees in the United States is because of politics. Because we came here as cheap labor, or we were enslaved and we were brought here, or we were displaced by American foreign policy, or wars were fought in our country. And so ironically, you know, many Asians are here in the United States because wars were fought in Asia. And for a lot of Asian immigrants and refugees, it somehow felt safer to be behind the guns than in front of the guns. That's a political crisis. And so, for example, you know, we've just gone through a period in which there's been a spike in anti-Asian violence, and all the good liberals came out and said, we're against anti-Asian violence. And of course you are. But the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence are America's wars in Asia. Are you against America's wars in Asia? Doesn't seem to be the case, even for liberals. You know, and so, you know, part of the reason why I was reluctant to write a memoir is I felt that part of the identity crisis for those of us who are people of color, or immigrants, or refugees, or so-called minorities, is that when we're allowed to write our memoirs, we're only allowed or expected to write about our individual trauma. You know, for us who are Vietnamese, it's the Vietnam War. Every so-called minority in this country has one trauma you're allowed to speak on as the expert on that trauma. But you're not allowed to or expected to speak about anything else. And so we Vietnamese people, we're allowed to speak about the refugee experience because we're refugees. But we're not expected to speak about the Vietnam War. That's the property of white people or white Americans. And so in order for me to feel like I could write this memoir, I also had to feel like I could write about the entire country, the United States, as well. I have a line in the book that says, you know, I'm not allowed to be the great American novelist. You know, you have to be a white man to be a great American novelist. So instead, I'm the not-so-great American novelist. I write the not-so-great American novel, the not-so-great American memoir, because I want to confront America in all of its complexity. I want to write about me and my mother and my family. All that personal sob story, trauma story stuff is in this book. But so is the story of the country as I see it as well.
Well, now I want to go out for fusion tacos. So, what is a fusion taco? Speaking of your family, you know, whenever you find out a writer is going to write a memoir, I think one of the first things we think is, you know, what's your family going to say? What are your friends going to say? With your situation, you know, there's the issue of language, of course, accessibility of the language. But I think it's at the end, you talk about getting final permission from your brother. Are you okay talking about maybe how your family reacted to the fact that you're writing this book, if how involved they were? Could you just talk about what went on there?
Well, there's a line in the book where I go, my parents didn't realize they were raising one of the most frightening creatures in the world, a writer. Yeah, you know, I mean, I my parents, we came to San Jose in 1978. My parents opened this Vietnamese grocery store called the Saigon Mui, and they ran it for a decade, and it was a horrible experience, because it was a typical refugee immigrant shopkeeper experience where they had to work every day of the week for 12 or 14 hours a day, and they experienced violence. There was shot in their store on Christmas Eve. We had this home invasion. There was all this emotional fallout from this experience because, again, classic refugee or immigrant story, my parents were working this hard in order to save us. And then that was also the action that destroyed me, at least emotionally, and them too, I think, in a certain way. And so I saved myself by going to the library and reading books and running away from that world. And that was how I decided to become a writer, And then one of the reasons why I never wanted to write a memoir is, as you acknowledged, to write a memoir means that you are not only talking about yourself, but inevitably you have to talk about other people, the people closest to you, whether it's your family or your community, whatever that is. And a lot of these people don't want to be talked about. They don't want you to talk about their intimacies, their secrets, their dirty laundry. Or if you do talk about your family or your community, they want you to put them in the best possible light. But the role of the writer, as I see it, is to tell the truth, whatever that might be for you, but also to tell what must not be told, whether it's the truth about yourself, the people you love, or your country. And so it was really, for me, when I was writing this book, I didn't tell anyone I was writing, in my family, I was writing this book. And my mother died in 2018, and that was I think the event that also besides the pandemic made me think I needed to write this memoir. And I was finding free to write it because I met so many people who said, I really want to write a memoir, write about my family, but I'm afraid because I don't want to hurt people. And there's no good answer for that situation. I waited until my mother passed away, and now my father is turning 90, and so he's not really cognizant in so many ways. But they were so proud of me becoming a writer. Not that they ever read what I wrote, because I was like, it's already a sacrifice that you've raised me. I don't want you to sacrifice more by having to read my books. So we only talked about how many copies I sold, which always made them happy. But when I finished this book, I did contact my brother, who's 7 years older, and he's always been a great big brother to me. And I said, look, I wrote this, and you're in it, and maybe you want to read it. And I sent it to him, and he didn't reply. And then we're so dysfunctional. My sister-in-law, a few weeks later, said, he has this memoir from you, and he doesn't want to read it. He refuses to read it. Why not? And I said, you tell me, why not? And then, so literally, she told him. So that's how we communicate. It's through our wives. I mean, we don't communicate directly. And so then, a week later, he comes back. Of course, he emails me, and he says, I read the memoir, and you got it right. And then that's what I acknowledged in the book. And then when the book came out, and he emailed me after he read the book, and he said, I read it twice, and you got it right. And that was very powerful for me, obviously, to feel that I'd gotten it right. But also, I'd already made up my mind that even if he didn't want me to, I would have published the book anyway. So, that's not the right road for every writer. And there's so many different ways to approach the memoir and to approach talking about your family. I just did an interview with Beth Nguyen, also a Vietnamese refugee, who wrote a book called Owner of a Lonely Heart, which is a memoir. And she interviewed her family and, said that there's certain things she won't say if they don't agree to it. And that's a very valid approach, but that was not going to be me. But I'm just lucky that my brother agreed. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad he did. Should we open it up to the audience now? Okay, great.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have library folks collecting questions, so if you haven't, there we go, thank you. In the meantime, I'll start with one of my questions. So I'm curious, what are some other books or even other forms of media that you feel like your memoir is in conversation with?
Oh, yeah. Well, great. I mean, for about 10 years, I had an active Twitter account, and I learned that I should not have a Twitter account. But I also learned how to write very, very short, very quick epigrammatic ways and very punchy, and how to tell a joke in like 140 characters or less, and all of that was very important in this memoir. I mean, it's 400 pages long, but there's a lot of white space in there, so you can read it pretty quickly, I think. And then I also watch a lot of stand-up comedians. So sometimes I'm up at 2 in the morning, Instagram reels, scrolling through stand-up comedians, and I've learned a lot from their technique as well, both as a speaker and also as a writer. And there's a lot of jokes in this book, because again, if you're an immigrant or a refugee, person of color, and so on, as Anthony Viasna-So says in After Parties, sometimes you feel like the only thing you can do is tell sob stories. My life is so sad, we're just going to shed tears. And in his book After Parties, which is about Cambodian refugees, the father character says, well, I survived the Cambodian genocide. And if I were in the Survivor reality show on TV, I would win, because the genocide was the best training. I mean, like, that's horrible, but it's so funny, and it's true, and that's why there's no Cambodian people on Survivor, because they would win every single episode. So you have to be able to tell jokes to both survive, but also jokes are a political tool. They're a political weapon. If you've read The Sympathizer and The Committed, it's full of jokes, and that's very powerful. Children's literature. I became a father, and reading children's literature was so powerful for me. I hadn't read it in 30 years. And with a kid, my son, he doesn't know any boundaries or rules, regulations, and that's enormously frustrating in some ways, but it's also freeing. And then reading what he was reading, like he loves books like Dog Man. I don't know if any of you know who Dog Man is. Dog Man is a super cop with the body of a muscular cop and the head of a dog. You have to read it to find out how this happens. And he stars in books called Fetch 22 and For Whom the Ball Rolls, and they're awesome. And so why do children's authors get to do whatever they want, but we as adult literary authors, we have, constraints? It makes no sense. And so it was really freeing to read that. Yeah, and then poetry. Oh, there's more room to talk about that too.
Speaking of children, how have your children shown glimpses of an identity beyond the binary of Vietnamese and American? How do you envision a hybridity for ensuing generations?
Yeah, that's great. I'm of a generation, technically 1.5 generation, born in Vietnam, raised in the United States, and the people older than me. I think for so many of us, we were so affected by the history of the war, colonization, the refugee experience. It's hard for us to think about other things. And there's nothing wrong with that. We writers have to have obsessions, and those happen to be my obsessions, and I'm going to work through them for a very long time. But people of a new generation, a different set of concerns that are equally valid. And I think so much of my work outside of being a writer is about, as I say in this book, attempting to do my bit to abolish the conditions of voicelessness. And by that, I mean that in the United States, if you happen to, again, be of an immigrant, refugee, so-called minority background or whatever, and you become a writer, you are pitted against an industry and a dominant society that only wants voices for the voiceless. They want one person at a time from a given community, right? And again, you're only expected to write about your community. You're only expected to write about your trauma. And really, what we should be doing is abolishing the conditions of voicelessness, because people are not voiceless. Like I was called a voice for the voiceless when The Sympathizer came out, and I'm Vietnamese, and many of you are Vietnamese, and some of you are not. But those of you who are not, have you ever been to a Vietnamese house? A Vietnamese restaurant? We're really, really loud. So we're not voiceless, but we are, as Arundhati Roy says, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. They're only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And so then we have voices for the voiceless, and then the temptation for so many of these voices for the voiceless is to serve as gatekeepers to the next generation. I don't want to do that. Nobody should do that. We should be opening the gate. We should be abolishing those conditions. And that means that for a younger generation like my children or many of you who are I don't know what young is, but let's say 20 or 30, I have no idea what your stories are. But I want to help you tell your stories. And they should be completely catching me by surprise. They should be upsetting me. I've tried to prevent my son from upsetting me, because the penultimate chapter says, if my children don't like this memoir, they have my blessing to write their own memoirs, which is my reverse psychology. If I give them permission, maybe they won't feel the need to write a memoir. But the whole point is to allow your children, to allow the next generation to tell their own stories, whatever those happen to be. And so my children are growing up. My son calls himself a Vietnamese American. And he knows words like colonialism and racism, and we just watched Barbie, patriarchy. And we started talking about these things at a very young age, at 3 or 4. He came home at 3 from his very liberal private school, or whatever, kindergarten or whatever, preschool, and it was Thanksgiving, and he said, Thanksgiving, and I said, genocide. And so I taught him genocide at 3 years of age. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because our entire society is geared to tell us that Thanksgiving is about family and ritual and heartwarming food and all that kind of stuff, all of which is true. But it's also about genocide. And so a book like this and a life like mine, about being a man of two faces, is about confronting that complexity and that contradiction and not running away from it. So when it comes to my children, of course I want them to grow up in a happy household. I don't charge them rent, for example. I don't make them work, But they're going to grow up in a household full of books and ideas, and I'm not going to let them, encounter dominant ideology, which exists everywhere, which saturates our very air, and walk into that environment unprepared. Because if they did, they would come out, already imbibing racist, colonialist, sexist, homophobic concepts. And it's up to us as parents, even if we're going to give them, even if we're going to open the door and let them do what they want to do, we also have to be responsible. And so I don't want them to feel trapped in their identities, but I want them to know that other people will trap them in identities, and they have to be ready for that. And so that's a complicated task for me of being a parent, preparing, but also letting go of them at the same time.
Thank you. Can you please talk about your use of the first person narrative and then the shift to the second person? The letter was very effective for me, whoever said that, and me, as a reader, with the line, "Or the quiet American could be you," which was piercing.
Well, if you read The Sympathizer and The Committed, both of those books are mostly in the first person, and then at a certain point near the end, they slip into different points, is it second or third person? I can't remember. But I wrote the books and I can't remember. But and I did that in those books to signal that something traumatic had happened, that the first person narrator who you've been carried along with on this journey for many, many pages, something terrible has happened, and the narrator is so shaken up. And how do I convey that? On the one hand, I could tell you, I'm shaken up. But it's actually much more effective, I think, to make you experience through the language and the way the book is told that the narrator has been destabilized in some terrible way. And so likewise, when I wrote this book, it starts off in the first person, but it's a book that's about the way that I've been damaged by history, by things that have happened to me, but that in the ways in which I've also been damaged by myself. And that in order to confront that, I had to shake myself up. And one of the ways to do that is to slip, hopefully subtly, into the second person. And because the book is about a man of two faces, I'm talking with myself through much of the book, I and you, because I'm interrogating myself as well. And I'm holding myself responsible. So, some people will read this book and they'll be like, oh my God, he is so angry. And I am angry. He's so angry about the United States. He's so angry about colonialism. He's so angry about racism and all this kind of stuff. I'm also angry at myself. How did I turn out this way? How did I deceive myself? And so I'm not just subjecting the country to an interrogation, I'm subjecting myself to an interrogation. The country is the quiet American, the country is the ugly American, and I'm both. And so I think that's the other thing. It's like when you're a refugee or an immigrant to this country, it's easy to be tempted into the victim narrative. Like, we've been subjected to racism, and therefore we're only victims. We're not responsible for anything as minorities in this country. But in fact, we are. As Asian Americans, for example, we're easily tempted by white supremacy. We're easily tempted to side with dominant society in this country. As people of color, we're tempted to be Americans. We may be subjected to racism in this country, but then we participate in the military-industrial complex. We may resent being policed or incarcerated or being subjected to violence, but then we endorse a country, being in a country where we can fire drone missiles into any country we want, whenever we want. That's a test for us as Americans, it's a test for me. And I'll end with one last example, which is, Vietnamese refugees come to this country. And my experience was that we became citizens, many of us, and we became Americans. And that was an unironic act for so many of us. That's the trajectory. We've been rescued by this country. Now we're going to become a part of it and give back to it. And when I first came to this country, we were settled in a refugee camp called Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And I have to admit, for 40 years of my life, I never thought twice about why this place was called Indiantown Gap and why there was a fort there. And obviously the reason is because white settlers built a fort there to defend themselves or to wage war against the Susquehannock and the Conestoga people. And most of those people had been wiped out by 1700. And most of the remaining people were massacred by a vigilante group, white vigilante group, called the Paxton Boys. And we left the camp and we ended up in Harrisburg, right outside the camp, and we bought a house, or my parents bought a house, and last year my brother found the deed to the house. My parents bought that house in Lower Paxton Township. What does it mean to be a refugee, to come to this country and become an American on indigenous land? What does our citizenship mean? Are we as refugees and immigrants an alibi for this country? An alibi for the American dream? I mean, that's the kind of interrogation that I'm also conducting. Again, both of the country, but also of myself and of my fellow Vietnamese refugees, and our own consciousness, our own responsibility, and our own susceptibility to this American dream narrative.
Vietnam War survivors are in their 90s. Our parents are tight-lipped about what they went through due to trauma. I know for me, like, I'm the first generation born in America. I don't know anything about what my family went through in the Philippines. You know, I think it's a common thing for a lot of us. I'm afraid these stories are getting lost. Do you share that same fear? Can you talk a bit about that?
I never forget that the ending of Toni Morrison's Beloved, which hopefully you've all read, or at least know the story about, you know, the ending of the story, I mean, it's about slavery and all these horrors and post-slavery and about what Morrison called rememory. For her, the rememory is this idea that the past is never past. That's Faulkner's idea, and then she rewrites it in her own way as rememory. This idea that the slavery, the plantation never goes away. It's always there, waiting for you. And at the end of the book, though, she says, this is not a story to pass on, meaning at least two things. This is not a story to ignore, and also this is not a story to keep on transmitting. And that's beautiful and that's brilliant because it's a paradox and it's a contradiction, and our country is a paradox and our country is a contradiction. We are both the country of liberty, democracy, freedom, and so on, all these great, wonderful ideals that I've benefited from as a writer and as a reader. And we're also the country that's built on genocide, enslavement, colonization, war, and so on and so forth. Both those things are true all at the same time. At least half this country wants to deny that. And that doesn't make us unique. Most nationalists in all countries want to deny the fact that their nations were founded on violence and colonization, which is true for the Vietnamese as well. You know, most Vietnamese people would say, we were colonized for 1,000 years by the Chinese, look at us. But very few Vietnamese people would say, we colonized Vietnam. We conquered the Cham and the Cambodians. We took their land, which we did. And in my case, as Vietnamese Catholics, we settled and colonized the Central Highlands in Vietnam. So my family, I think, were settler colonizers in Vietnam and refugees at the same time. All these things are true, all at the same time. So in response to the question that's being asked, it's a question that's why you need a paradoxical and a contradictory answer. I can't get up here and say you should never forget the past, because you shouldn't, but at the same time you should. And the challenge for us is, how do we get to the point where we have earned the right to forget? That's the problem. And this country, like so many other countries, has not earned the right to forget. We have not done the work. We have not fully confronted our past, whatever that is, whether the past is enslavement or genocide or wars that we've done. And so long as we haven't earned the right to forget, we will not forget. We will think we have forgotten. We will pretend we have forgotten. As individuals, we may not know anything, but as a society, we have not forgotten. That's why American history is not linear. And so people who believe in the American dream will say, we are on this linear story that leads us to an ever more perfect union. That's the liberal dream of this country. my version of the country is we're cyclical. We will repeat our history over and over and over again because we're built on a contradiction that we have not fully confronted. And that's why I think, as a Vietnamese refugee writing a Vietnamese story, it is a very Vietnamese story, but it's also an American story. Because the Vietnam War for me happened because of cycles of American history. What the United States did in Vietnam looked a lot like what the United States did in the Philippines. And what the United States did in Vietnam looks a lot like what we did in Afghanistan. And that's why I'm very pessimistic that there won't be another Philippines or Vietnam or Afghanistan in terms of wars in our future. Because again, we have not confronted our past. So yes, struggle to tell a new story, but recognize that the past, we haven't earned the right to leave that behind yet.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then I'll bring up Aaron Steinhauer from the Vietnam Society for some closing remarks. So our final question for the day: what advice would you give to aspiring writers who want to explore their own life stories through memoir or autobiography, or even through, fiction?
I wrote my first book and drew my first book when I was 8 years old in the 3rd grade. And the book was called Lester the Cat. Lester was an urban cat, stricken with ennui, bored with city life. He fled to the countryside. There, in a hay-strewn barn, he found love with a country cat. So the San Jose Public Library gave Lester the Cat a book award. It was my first taste of literary fame. So I'm forever grateful to the public library for encouraging me and setting me on the path to over 30 years of misery in trying to become a writer. So this is not true for all writers out there. Some of you are hot young geniuses who will publish your first book when you're 25. And if you are that kind of a person, I hate you. Most of us take the other path, the 30 years. Could be miserable, could just be hard, whatever. But the only advice I have to give is exactly that, which is that I think, and Leslie, you can disagree or add your own wisdom. I'd love to hear it too. But the only things it takes to be a writer, number one, is willing to read a great deal and willing to write a lot. And for me, I think it was really like 10,000 hours of sitting alone in a room writing that turned me into a writer. Because you can take all the classes you want, you can read all the writing books you want, whatever. Nothing substitutes for the actual act of writing. And you teach yourself. You can get all the advice, all the tips and techniques, but you teach yourself by trial and error how to write. But also, you teach yourself the discipline of writing. And when I say discipline, I mean, it's not just an act of sitting in a chair for 10,000 hours. To me, it's a spiritual discipline. I feel that if I wasn't a writer, I would be a priest, if priests were allowed to be married, for example. It's that same kind of idea of a calling. And you confront yourself on a daily basis or a weekly basis, however you choose to write. And you learn to live with yourself, and you learn to live with your art over that time span of 10,000 hours. And I think that's the advice I have to give you. Are you willing to do that? And you could do the 10,000 hours in 10 years, you could do it in 30 years, you could do it in 50 years, it doesn't matter, but you have to do it. And that's the advice. If you're willing to do it, you will become a writer. Doesn't mean you'll be a good writer, but you will become a writer. It doesn't mean you'll be a published writer, but you will become a writer. And if you do those 10,000 hours, the other metaphor that Haruki Murakami had in his book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Running, is that it's like drilling into rock. You drill long enough and hard enough, you'll reach water. And that's it. To be a writer memoir, you drill enough, long enough, hard enough, you'll find the terror inside, the emotions inside, the vulnerability inside. It's incredibly hard work. And I have to say, I'm a masochist, so I find great pleasure in it. And I wish you the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, everyone, how amazing. This has been such a delightful afternoon. I could not believe the turnout today. You guys are so amazing. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for Vic, to Leslie, for giving us a glimpse into your personal stories, into we covered so much ground today. It helped me to interrogate myself as a refugee, really think through all of these topics, even as a parent, not have the conditions, not be the gatekeeper, being cut to the bones. Thank you so much for this afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. After this, there would be a book signing outside. We love it if you stayed and just mingle with all of us. The outside is also open for us to just get to know each other. But thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you again, Vic and Leslie.
Picture, because I want to escort him up quickly.